Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode of InRange. This is going to be a very interesting roundtable conversation that even if this isn't something you think you're going to be interested in, you're going to be interested in if you're willing to sit through it long enough to listen to it, which I think you will. What we have here is a roundtable of real subject matter experts in the regards to malware development and research and development and engineering. Malware is, as with other technology, firearms included, of course, agnostic. It's what you do with technology that dictates whether it's bad, good, or something otherwise. And we see this with gun laws, we see this with regulations of guns worldwide. It's a cultural and government phenomena. Some places are more restrictive, some are less. Some places you can open carry constitutionally, some places you can't even have a knife. And this kind of thing is starting to merge more and more into the digital world. We saw this with the old crypto wars that I dealt with way back when, in which certain types of just software and code was considered a munition and regulated like a weapon. And now we're seeing this with malware development, research and development, and engineering. Malware is the idea of researching software that can be used for malicious things, but also can be done in a positive way to try and determine what the attack vectors are, harden our software, harden our community, and that's the only way to figure this out is by doing that types of R&D. Anyways, that's the intro. I have some real subject matter experts here. What I want to let them do is introduce themselves because they'll do it better than I will. Let's start with Steve.
Me.
Yeah.
Somehow, in this table of subject matter experts, I snuck in because I am much more on the kinetic side of the house. I mean, I came from a network background, but I do the covert entry work nowadays. Although I'm in with the hacker community, this is a topic we all talk about, and I can't wait till you summarize your comments from dinner that kicked this all off. I'm very good friends with some people in the community that have been directly impacted by some of the court battles that we're going to talk about. And I'm just happy to know people way smarter than me who can speak about this topic.
And there's another convergence there real quick before we move on with lockpicking and such. Lockpicks in and of themselves is another agnostic tool.
That's true.
Yep.
That's true.
Yeah.
My name is John Strand. I'm the owner of Black Hills Information Security. We specialize in cyber offensive operations. And doing that, we deal in cyber arms. That's part of what we do every single day. I have a background, like some other people around here, Department of Defense intelligence community, and also in the commercial area. And this is a topic that's very important to me. I'm not, as quote unquote, I'm one of those people that's not that into guns. I do own firearms. But at the same time, it's the same concept that we see as a Second Amendment fight for firearms that also applies to what we're dealing with right here with cyber arms as well. And I think that that's a right that needs to be protected across the board.
Yep, that's what we're going to be talking about right now.
Sure. My name is Jake Williams. I run Rendition InfoSec, a consulting company involving information security. Like John, I actually do a lot of offensive work. We also specialize a lot in incident response. We monitor a lot of client networks, and we actually do a lot more of the, in addition to the offensive work, the mopping up the mess when the attackers come in. Right? How did they get in? What do they do? What kind of capabilities do they have? How are those advancing? And so, like John, I came out of the DoD intelligence community, that's pretty much it.
So let's explain to the audience, first of all, what we mean when we say offensive. What do you mean when you say you're doing offensive work? Can you explain that?
We both break into places to make sure that other people can't break into places.
But you're hired to do that.
We are absolutely hired to do
so
that.
You're
full legal representation.
You're the red team that
That's
goes
what
in,
you call that.
infiltrates
Absolutely.
the network, and what that does is it allows the customer to understand the vulnerabilities that exist in their network and have a true understanding of the risk that's posed to them. So you have to actually, not maliciously, intentionally and positively attack that network and determine what those problems are.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If you remember the movie Sneakers,
Yep.
right, from back in the day, circa 1992, right, around the 25th anniversary year, and that movie has actually got me interested in this field, right? So, outstanding movie. While technically inaccurate in a lot of places, it's the kind of work that we. I can't believe I'm critiquing a Hollywood movie for technical accuracy,
Sure, of course, yeah.
But you get the idea, right? It's the kind of work that we do.
So a rough analogy in the physical world, for the gun guys would be like force-on-force training. So we go out there, we set up our guns with sims. We don't necessarily intend to kill anyone because we know we're not going to, but we go out there and legitimately try to use our best tactics and weaponry and gear to defeat the other team. And that's done kinetically. This is an analog to doing it digitally.
Yes, absolutely.
And even for, in the kinetic world, very damaging munitions and very powerful compounds, it's important that there are stockpiles of these, that there are test case uses, so that if there's an explosion somewhere, someone can do chemical trace analysis and say, well, this was RDX, in fact, we think it came from here, and reconstruct what happened. And that's a lot of the idea of keeping, well, why does anyone keep malware samples around? Why would anyone need this? The reversing you do today can help identify and attribute the attack that happens on a power grid tomorrow.
And a physical equivalent of that, again, would be like forensic analysis of spent casings on the ground, maybe the bullet or rifling marks on a projectile that's found in someone or in a wall, or on like biochemical weapons, the idea that you might even have like sarin gas samples or biological weapons. So when someone deploys something like that, you can actually determine what they did, like that Japanese Colt.
And that's exactly what rendition does, right? Rendition has that ability to actually look at the cyber munitions that were utilized, how they were utilized, how were they communicating back to Russia, were they communicating back to China, and being able to try to piece together what happened forensically. But you cannot have that skill set at all. Like rendition wouldn't be good at what you guys do if you didn't have the capability of actually doing the offensive component and understanding the offense from it as well.
And to do that means that you have to sit down and write a piece of software that could be, of course, agnostic again, but is intentionally an offensive piece of technology.
Absolutely.
And I guess a great example of this too, right, is I presented at Black Hat a number of years ago, a couple of years ago, about basically using Dropbox. Right, so writing malware to go use Dropsmack, right? To go use Dropbox to basically steal files from a network, right? John, I know, has been involved in a number of other projects that have been publicly released, and these are all projects that have been used for both good and bad. Right, I'm quite positive. I have good evidence, in fact, that some folks have taken my code and have done bad things with that. Right. The fact of the matter is, we research this stuff so we as defenders can understand what it's going to look like when an attacker actually uses it.
Well, on that note, again, when we come back to guns, for example, Eugene Stoner and Jim Sullivan, when they were designing the AR-15 rifle, did not design it so that someone could go spree shoot up a mall or a movie theater. They designed it as a weapon for good, for the most part. They were trying to provide a positive piece of equipment for the U.S. military. But people use it sometimes for bad, and a gun in the hands of someone who's well-minded and a good guy does good things. A gun in the hands of a bad guy does bad things, and a gun just sitting there does nothing. The same thing can be done with technically offensive software.
And I think that that's one of the major problems, right? Like I said, I don't know very much about firearms. I just don't. It's not something I was ever raised with. It's not something we do on a regular basis. But one of the arguments that I constantly see whenever you're having conversations with people, not just people that aren't into guns, but people that are against firearms, is they always like to say the argument of, well, that firearm was created for military purposes. There's absolutely no fundamental reason why anybody would ever need that firearm for day-to-day activities. And I think that it shows fundamental ignorance, and I mean that in the best possible way. I mean, they're not willfully ignorant in a lot of situations, but they're ignorant in the aspect that you can have one rifle that's got black and it's got a handle and it's got all kinds of things and it looks really scary, and you can have another one that's got a wood handle and it looks like a hunting rifle, and it's effectively the exact same firearm in both situations. Just one looks different. And I think that that's one of the bigger problems that we're fighting, especially with what we do. People ask us all the time, why do you need to do what you do? You just shouldn't do that. And it's somehow that willful ignorance that it becomes dangerous. It becomes to the point where people want that level of safety from malware. They want that level of safety from firearms. And they think magically, if they could make them go away, then all the problems would go away. Hackers would stop hacking. There'd be no reason for people to need to defend themselves or hunt or anything like that. And I think that these themes are tied together very, very closely between the world of firearms and the world of cyber munitions and cyber firearms as well.
Right now in the firearms and kinetic side of things, we understand that there are some gun regulations, like who can or can't own guns. We don't, not too much yet, see liability suits against manufacturers of guns, although some places want this. What is the current landscape of liability, and what do you open yourselves up to by possessing and owning things?
I think
or
he
even writing
actually
things?
is one of the best people to talk about this.
Yeah,
We'll talk a little bit.
No, totally.
On
the liability side, there's some pretty scary cases floating around right now. 2 foreign researchers, one from China, one from the UK, have been arrested in the U.S. in the last 2 months based on the fact that some of their code has been used maliciously. Right now, there's different arguments from the FBI as to whether they profited from some of this code, but from a liability standpoint, there's some really chilling. This is some really chilling development, or are some really chilling developments. Again, I can say with zero hesitation that code that I've written has ended up in malware. I've seen it as I'm reverse engineering. I'm like, I recognize that because that's my code, right? And then we turn back around here, and you could also make the argument pretty substantially. One of the pieces that I wrote, an anti-forensics framework, I wrote for SANS, right? Basically, as a research project, basically to demonstrate a fundamental flaw in some of our forensics techniques. I profited from that through SANS, right? And the FBI could make a fairly compelling argument that I wrote malware code, knowing I would be paid for it at the time, and then released it into the world, and it's, as a consequence, been used maliciously.
This is the reason I brought up two firearms designers previously just a moment ago, were Eugene Stoner and Jim Sullivan, because the AR-15 project. This would be similar to saying that because Jim Sullivan designed the AR-15 and then someone used an AR-15 for a malicious reason, you go arrest Jim Sullivan and put him in jail. Why did you design this piece of equipment that could do this? That really is the real world direct analog.
And some of the emails that I've gotten, in particular about the ADD, it's attention deficit disorder, this anti-forensics framework. Some of the emails that I have received from other forensic examiners are very vile. I mean, like the kind of, oh yeah, die in a fire. I hope your kids. Anyway, just nasty, nasty stuff. And it's really, really bad. And it turns out in every case that I've been able, in every case where somebody's let me come back and look, they think it's me directly, my code directly, and it's modifications of my code really that have gotten out there, which is a whole separate issue. You bring back the firearm piece, there are obvious derivatives. The Daewoo DR200, right, is a derivative of an AR-15. And of course, as you look at this, we have the same thing in digital weapons, right, where we have derivative works as well. So,
and I think whenever I start having conversations with people, whether we're talking about malware in the computer space or you're talking about firearms, I detect that there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding, right? Like people like to paint all hackers as antisocial people in base. Okay, well we might.
Well, okay.
Actually,
Maybe some of them, but
but
you can't paint with that broad a brush.
But you do try, right? And I have family members that are ranchers and avid hunters, and I have family members that are on the other side of that spectrum. And what I find is interesting consistently is on the other side of the spectrum, there's this assumption that if somebody has a firearm, they're automatically an ignorant gun nut, and they know absolutely nothing. They got big wheel pickup trucks and all these things. They create that very wide kind of paint, like you said, a very large brush whenever they paint with it. And we deal with that exact same thing. And we deal with a lot of the exact same comments. Why would anybody need that? Well, if you didn't teach people or if you didn't create this, then that wouldn't exist. And one of the quotes that I thought was very, very interesting, that I thought was interesting, it was on a Facebook conversation about firearms. Somebody said, well, if you could make it so firearms disappeared from the entire face of the planet, would you take that? And I think, yeah, that sounds absolutely fantastic. If that was where we actually headed, that would be great. But that utopia does not exist. And ultimately, the only thing that's protecting us from ultimate chaos in a lot of ways is the fact that we've had firearms. We've had the ability to defend ourselves through various wars. And in computer security, it's very much the exact same way. We have to have these offensive capabilities to be able to test and reinforce our networks so that we can be protected. Because if you and I stop creating malware, the bad guys are not going to stop. Their malware is going to get better, and we're not going to be in a position to defend ourselves at all.
A lot of people in the gun community are familiar with an anti-gunner's argument is never just, hey, guns are bad, I don't like them. They usually bring a whole sack full of, and here's the policies and laws we need.
Baggage. Yeah.
What kind of arguments are there on the IT side, in the InfoSec world, where people say, you shouldn't be allowed to write, possess, use malware unless or accept or licensure?
Germany, definitely.
Was it 303C or 302C?
I think it's 302C.
Is this
302C, yeah. So in German, they came up with a law. It's 302C that says it's unlawful to yield or to create, produce, distribute, or otherwise possess any cyber malware that can be used for intrusions. And that's a ridiculous ruling, right?
No exceptions for anyone?
None whatsoever.
No exceptions whatsoever. It eventually went up to the German Federal Constitutional High Court. And the German Federal Constitutional High Court read it and said, well, this only applies to malware that was created with malicious intent. And once again,
how
we can't define what that actually is. So I know Dropsmack, we've seen Dropsmack being used by bad people. We created a tool called GCAT that all the communication goes through Gmail, and that part of that code was used in the Ukraine power grid attacks. And that always hurts, right? When you see your baby out there doing something or being used for bad things, but you got to learn to separate. The malware is the malware. The people that use it are the people that are doing the fundamentally bad things. But the problem is people are trying to come up with these laws, and they're trying to bundle intent into it, and they're trying to squirrel around it. And it's going to become problematic, especially in Europe, I believe. But here in the U.S. with the stuff with the FBI that I'm hoping you can talk to.
When you talked about the intent piece, right, I like to think about the analogy that I kind of kept back to is Oppenheimer, right? Oppenheimer, and I hate to I hate to hit another touch button issue there, but Oppenheimer, I've become death, destroyer of worlds, right? He did the research, he laid it out. Somebody else, the U.S. government decided what to do with that. Right? I think he had no malicious intent in his design. Or his physics there, effectively. But again, some of the end result, I wonder if Oppenheimer could roll that back. Would he? We don't live in that utopia.
But it's not that different either, because if you keep rolling that forward, and let's say World War II extended for another 8 years or 10 years or something, it wasn't like the Nazis weren't doing nuclear research.
Sure.
It could have been New York City instead of Hiroshima. That technology, that cat would have gotten out of the bag inevitably at some point.
Correct.
And it would have gotten into someone's hands. It's the question of whose hands and how they leverage it.
And I also come back to the idea of tools. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about here are tools. A firearm is a tool at the end of the day. Growing up in ranching communities in South Dakota and ranching with my grandfather, a firearm was not just for self-protection, but it was a tool that you'd use if a cow had a broken leg or a horse had a broken leg. It was a tool that you used with a tremendous amount of fun to clear out prairie dogs.
That's true. It's
and I know
great,
that people in the comments are going to mention poor prairie dogs. But at any rate, the point is they are tools, right? And how those tools are used are really, really more, the responsibilities of the person that uses that tool more so than anything else. And the other thing that I'd like to come back to is the vast majority of firearm owners, they're good people. Yeah. They're not the people that are going through and shooting up and doing the mass shootings. They aren't.
That's also
There's
the same.
Millions.
That's also the same for what they call hackers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say in this industry now, I'd say if we go back 10 years, a lot of people that were in this industry, it was a kind of a darker path back then. But now it's legitimate. We have large conferences, people get together, we're sharing information, and it's making it better all the way across the board.
Touch on something there. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's maturity? Do you think those people just grew up and decided to do something different? What do you think? What do you think that shift? Was it strictly monetary? I don't know that
but
it is.
I think the maturity was part of it too.
Yeah.
I think that at the the Hackers movie, the tagline was their only crime was curiosity, and I usually like to say their crime was curiosity and breaking into banks. Right. Realistically.
Yeah.
But other than those two things, but a lot of it was fueled by curiosity in the early days. It's like, what can you get access to? You got a modem, you connect to a phone line, and it's just like war games. All of a sudden, you got this computer talking with you on the other side of the United States. You don't even know what it is. And sometimes they had protections, and sometimes they didn't. So there was a lot of that curiosity because it was all new. Everyone was stumbling around in the dark. Now it's developing a maturity, and the money is now involved, as you said.
Yeah,
so
I think that drives the maturity.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
You have a real job, and you have a real house payment and stuff.
But you also mentioned the enjoyment that can come from legitimate and reasonable use of a firearm, responsible use. Mm-hmm. At the same time, developing an elegant hack must bring joy.
Yes,
exactly.
I get up and do a happy
You see my
dance
point?
every time I pop a box.
Because that is that sense of exploration and figuring something out that didn't exist before, and advancing an art, whatever the art is, forward in a way that you can take pride in, or just going, oh my gosh, this is an incredible thing.
But there's also a safety mechanism. Like here in our classes that we teach, we have a very safe environment for a lot of our people. We set up, it's very, very controlled. And if people start getting out of hand, we kind of gently nudge them back into the fold. And let's use that idea with firearms. Almost every single person I've ever gone shooting with, every single one, that safety is paramount. It's absolute crazy first in line every single time. And if you watch, like a small child or anybody ever messes up, like even if the gun is unloaded and they accidentally point it at somebody, people react immediately. And there's a lot of that control around it, and that's, like you said, it's the maturity with it. Firearms, there's a very mature history. With cybersecurity, I hate to think that we're the ones that are the mature ones.
I know, tell me about it, yeah.
But that maturity is finally getting there. But my fear, going back kind of on topic, is you look at the arrests that have happened, and they haven't been prosecuted all the way. Some of us don't know all of the facts, or as many facts as others. But if the FBI is just arresting people because they possess or have created malware, we've just crossed a very, 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 very bad corner into a dark chapter in this country.
Now, the point that some people watching this might not quite grasp the thread of, well, wait, are there laws, aren't there laws? Right now, most of the malware-based prosecutions, as we say, there's no law yet explicitly saying in this country, like the German law, this is illegal, and yet people are being arrested here. Most people that get picked up by the FBI, and I want to be corrected if I'm wrong, they're almost always hearkening back to violations of our very infamous CFAA, which is a broadly written, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And I'm trying to come up with, and failing, maybe you can help me out with a parallel to guns. Imagine guns themselves were not regulated at all per se under the law, but using a firearm, oh, you discharged it outside of a range where you were allowed to be, and that's the only way people would be picked up.
I've got a possibly
What's a
decent
better
analogy.
analogy?
If you think about the Hutchins case, right? Hutchins, in addition to the CFAA, is being charged with wiretap violations, right?
Okay,
so
yes.
they're arguing, the FBI or the DOJ now is arguing that creating the malware that could have, they have no evidence that it ever did, but could have intercepted communications violates a wiretap act. They're basically twisting one law into, in my opinion, twisting one law and trying to apply it to another area here. I would parallel that in the firearms space maybe to, it's not illegal for you to own this weapon, but we believe that you shot at some fish and hence are in violation of a wildlife,
like a gaming law.
It's
Well,
interesting.
that's just it. You can find other laws, like you've discharged a firearm, or you were hunting during off hunting season, even though you're just shooting, like you've come out to my property.
Right.
They could say, well, you were hunting. No, you weren't. We were shooting at targets. Well, they can kind of mold those laws around and try to twist them and use them in a
What
really
was your
perverse way.
intent? Was it really to shoot at
Was
the
it-
target? Or?
Well, there was a target, and it looked like a deer.
But at the same
so-
time, code is ultimately an expression of intellectual content, just like a book could be, and some books have been considered historically dangerous. So if you were to illegalize the concept of illegal or legalize risky thinking, malware could be considered risky thinking.
But I think that that's probably what you're hitting on, is it's a restriction of thought, right? And ultimately, if you're trying to restrict thought, you're trying to restrict capabilities. And if you're looking at firearms, you guys having firearms, the terrifying thought to people is that you have the capability of shooting people. You may not actually do that, or actually you won't do that, I know you guys, right? But it's the fear of this capability, it's the fear of the unknown, and it's like that, won't somebody think of the children paradox where you try to make things as safe as you possibly can? So it's that trying to restrict the capability, and to restrict the capability, restrict the thought. Guns are inherently bad. This expression of malware that you created is an inherently dangerous thought that you've expressed in computer code. And I feel like that all comes back to trying to create a nice, safe world that ultimately will never exist.
Well, this constant pursuit of this idea of security is unfortunately foolhardy because it is not reality. There are always going to be bad things that occur, and unfortunately always be malicious people or nation states that will do things that we would wish they did not. And so it is a unachievable goal, a utopia that will never be.
Yeah.
You weren't at dinner last night, it was 2 nights ago, when you said something that really, this is what perked us up.
Yeah.
You said, imagine a future where more and more malware code is like restricted, but in a patchwork, much in the way like nowadays gun owners try to go state to state, and what's legal for me in Montana was not legal in New Jersey. And imagine trying to do your jobs, and think about this of what if you couldn't actually pursue a case, well, I can't actually bring my computer to this state because they just passed a law against this, or do we see that now? Would you take a job in Germany, for example?
The real world example for me is I could be on the border of Arizona and California with a concealed submachine gun and a switchblade, cross the river and become a multiple felon by just crossing a river. This could happen with software and code development.
But that's how this happens, right? Like you can't win at the national level, right? You just can't.
The antis can't win.
You can't win, absolutely.
Right.
But if you can create pockets like Chicago and New Jersey, you're talking about Arizona and California, you can restrict that as much as you can to where it just isn't possible to do it effectively, to actually own a firearm. So right now we're not seeing that in states. I don't think we see those types of cybercrime laws in states yet. But as it's kind of nice for me with firearms, what's going on with firearms is what I see is going to happen with cyber in the next 10 years. So if we lose on this front, we're pretty much hosed on what's coming up with malware and creating offensive capabilities on computers.
And have we not seen them already start to do this? I mean, actually not start, but already we see iterations of that happening with digital space, for example, with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, in which just challenging encryption could be an illegal act.
Well, we've got
But I mean, we
ways
see
around
what I'm
that.
saying is we already see that groundwork has started with crypto. Malware could very well fall into that same paradigm.
If I may, coming back to the whole like individual pockets and areas, I had a flight a while back. We were was going into Southeast Asia, and was flying out of Europe into Southeast Asia, and we actually were crossing Iranian airspace, which is always fun. But Iran has some really interesting computer crime laws, to say the least, and we had a problem with an engine. And at one point, there was a question of were we going to make basically an emergency landing? And here I sit with 2 laptops, and I'm wondering to myself, what am I going to do? Because I have something that was legal where I took off, and it was legal where I intended to land,
Yep.
But it is entirely possible that we are going to now make an emergency landing or a diversion, and I'm going to land in a hostile state with contraband.
You would be the Greg Revell of malware. Like,
Right. No, I mean, very seriously, right? I mean, there's,
Yeah.
as far as the Iranians are concerned, there's, I've got literally a lifetime behind bars with a cyber weapon sitting in a laptop over there.
You might as well have a submachine gun and a rocket in your
Might as well
carry-on,
have,
right?
seriously.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd probably do better there with an AK-47 and an RPG.
You know what's funny though, because you were mentioning that Europe seems to be the tip of the spear of this type of cyber legislating, but at the same time, when you see in other ways Europe is progressive. Like for example, they do not embrace ignorance as a way to deal with sex education. So most of the educated world realizes that that ignorance is not the right answer to solve some of those problems, like the spreading of HIV, for example, using birth control. But when we see that, so ignorance is not the answer then, but suddenly when it's something we don't understand, be it a firearm or malware, suddenly ignorance is the answer. I find that's an interesting disconnect from people that are otherwise more rational.
I don't know, I could be wrong. There's all kinds of social scientists that speak on these things, but if you look at kind of the way Americans look at things, it is fundamentally different. We do a lot of training overseas, and Americans definitely have this concept of rugged self-reliance.
Yeah.
Right? There's this belief, and look at the crazy people that came to this country and moved out west. You get on a wagon, take your entire livelihood, and you got a lot in Oregon, and off you go. I think that is fundamentally different than a lot of people around the world. And I'm not saying it's better, I'm not saying it's worse,
Right.
but that rugged individual means that you have to be prepared, and you have to be ready for anything. And you see that all the time whenever you're talking to gun owners. They want to be prepared and be ready as a rancher for if they need to go shoot coyotes. They want to be prepared in someone's home if there is an invasion. And that's something that's with us, right? It's deep in our ingrained psyche. Whenever you go to other countries, I don't think that they have that. And you can get into all kinds of questions. I don't live in Europe, so I can't speak to it. But I do see that type of, like, trying to explain those fundamental problems doesn't really make much sense. And to be fair, if you go to a lot of those countries, the farmers and ranchers do have licenses for firearms.
Yeah,
they
no.
do. And they use them as tools, but that idea of that rugged self-individualism or that rugged self-reliance is something that is fundamentally missing from quite a few countries.
It's a more collectivist mindset. Whether that's right or wrong is irrelevant. It just is that.
Yeah. And you look at other countries that have that, like Israel definitely has that. Switzerland definitely has that. So there are countries that have that, and I think that's just a fundamentally different worldview. I don't necessarily know if it's ignorance. It might be. But once again, I'm not a social scientist.
This is a fascinating parallel, though. You called out I think what you were meaning is Switzerland, Israel are self-reliant cultures. They want to be able to defend their borders. Do you see parallels to, well, I don't know how many people work with Mossad or anything with trading code. Do you see Israel as a country that would restrict malware?
No.
Or would be less likely to?
They absolutely would not.
So
100%
then
less
it's going to be
likely.
very tied to this.
Some of the best computer security professionals, Zemfirium is ran by someone who we both know, who is, like, Zook is one of the best people in the world. And no, he's very open in sharing ideas and coming up with new security ideas. So no, absolutely not. They're definitely a country I would say that would be on that forefront in making that as available as possible.
Well, if you look at a lot of the cybersecurity startups, I'd say probably half of the major cybersecurity up-and-comers are coming out of Israel right now. So I mean, it's an interesting parallel that you make there. Again,
I think
most
that
of the
might have
folks
something to do with the
developing those-
national consciousness, the idea of the right to sort of not put your head in the sand. If there's a tool for the job, I want the best tool, and I don't care about the politics of it. It's sort of that culture.
Well, and their risk model is pretty different than a lot of the rest of the world as well,
Yes.
right? I mean, they are constantly under assault.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at, once again, fire twice and go home is a great quote, and that's just the mind view of it. So yeah, I think that you see that. But there are a lot of countries, like you talk about Germany, there's just no way they're going to be able to reconcile that law. There just isn't. Eventually it's going to come to a head.
Is it still on
And
the books
so-
now then?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just the way that it's been interpreted by the Federal Constitutional High Court.
So what that does is it puts them behind in what is ostensibly an arms race, right? So the German developers and our engineers, I think you could.
I
Is it
mean-
all cyber warfare a digital arms race, even good or bad, or neither here nor there?
I don't think it's an arms. I don't really consider it an arms race.
Oh, really?
I
So
think
I
that you
would've-
have. I think that you have a different perspective.
Yeah.
But I'm looking for more the corporate perspective. I don't think the corporations
Oh,
are
no,
looking at
definitely
it.
not.
I think
No.
from the government's perspective, absolutely, it's
Yeah.
a digital arms.
Well, that's what I mean by that. So that puts Germany in a way behind, right?
I
Doesn't,
don't
or do
think
they
that
just
it's-
develop their own government agency that's supposedly doing
Sure,
this
I-
for them?
I think that they would do that.
They have their
yeah.
secret
And they
little
have
room
great
somewhere,
people in
right?
that country
Yeah.
too.
Of course, the problem with that is if you illegalize, basically the act of dealing with these types of tools, right? Then you're feeder into those government agencies.
Yep.
You don't have people
starts
that have
to
ever
dry up.
legally done any of this, right? So basically, then you're either forced to go hire some people that are doing illegal things and then giving them better weapons, or training them from the ground up.
And the water level rises for everyone, regardless of where you are geographically. So one of you guys doing this kind of work here in the United States would ultimately benefit someone in Germany, whether they're just part of a government agency or not, because
See,
you're
that's-
developing things that they wouldn't.
That's one of the things that's interesting. That's a great point. Is like with this, it's very quick and easy for someone to come in and get caught up on where, not necessarily the bleeding edge of technology, but to be enough on the forefront of it. You can catch up fairly quickly. But I don't know at the nation state level, though. I don't know if that's true,
Well,
Jake.
I mean, I don't know that it was true a couple of years ago, right, to basically come in, be a player. But look, in the last 12 months, we've seen the shadow brokers. Shadow brokers have released a ton of NSA developed, or ostensibly NSA developed code. To my knowledge, they've never claimed that. Likewise, the Vault 7 through WikiLeaks have leaked a ton of CIA documents relating to their cyber warfare program. And so you have in the documents from the CIA, you have, again, ostensibly from, and I don't think they've claimed those either, but basically you've got all this background, this insight into how their developers think, right? Which presumably they've learned over, who knows, years to decades of experience in this type of field. Likewise, again, with the shadow brokers, you're seeing this code already being reused and weaponized. It's not just WannaCry. You probably remember WannaCry and some of the Ukraine attacks, where some of that code was reused. That's not the really chilling part. That was one exploit, right? There's tons of anti-forensics tools and anti-auditing tools that are built in there that we've seen. Some of those were released as early as January, and we saw that stuff cropping up by mid-February. So mid-January to mid-February, we're seeing people repurposing that code, reverse engineering, repurposing it. And I think these junior nations, as they were, right, coming up into that network
can make a
exploitation
leapfrog
space.
at that point.
Generational leaps, absolutely, yeah.
So, but as far as like nation state, hot nation state on nation state action, I think there were some things in that dump that were interesting. Like you were talking about the anti-audit stuff. That's a game changer. right?
Absolutely.
The exploits that were released, I don't think that there was a lot in the exploits that was incredibly earth-shattering. I mean, a lot of what you would expect.
Yeah.
Different exploits for different things that would be of interest for people doing that type of work.
Yep.
And then the Windows exploit. The scary thing for me is with that dump, right? That dump from the NSA and that dump from the CIA, is we haven't seen it all yet.
No, we definitely have not.
And that's
No, it's true.
it's what we don't know that's terrifying.
So one thing that comes to mind is, and most reasonable firearms owners think that there's a line somewhere in terms of what you can or can't do. Not some people disagree. Some people think you should be able to own a pocket nuke, right? But most guys, and their line. And the thing is, when you talk to them, the line shifts depending on them, their culture, where they live, the state they're in, the country they're in. So, for example, I would say that most gun owners, especially even the really pro ones, would think that they would at least think for a moment if it's okay to go buy a 12-pack of frag grenades at the local Walmart. Like, they think that maybe you shouldn't go buy 12 of those things and just start lobbing them at the mall. Like, I mean, okay, there might be, but the line shifts depending on the individual. Is there a line like that with this type of thing?
Is there any type of cyber weapon to
Or
buzzword? being out there?
development environment?
Any type of malware or any type of technique
no, that's a
that
very,
shouldn't be allowed to be explored?
it's a very loaded question, but is there a line there?
Yes, I think there would be a line. Whenever we create malware, a lot of our malware is direct. I send it to a computer system, I gain access to that computer system, and it's point to point, right? It's me and the victim's computer system in my customer's network. Where you start to cross that line, and I think it's a very bright line, let's put this in the tactical nuke category, is if I create a piece of malware that's self-replicating and it spreads on its own. Because at that point, I no longer have control over what I have created, and the damage is indiscriminate. And at that point, without question, you would be crossing the line. I would say that that's the tactical nuke level. And Jake, can you think of anything,
Yeah.
just taking a step back,
Yeah.
I got a couple, but I want to throw it to you first.
I'd actually like to walk that back. I used to work, and this is pretty much public knowledge now since the shadow
Yeah,
broker's
you're
outed
pretty
me.
much outed.
Yeah, I'm pretty much out. Well, pretty much nothing. I used to
You
work
are.
at NSA, and I was one of their hackers there for quite a number of years. And at NSA, it's been widely released at this point. They have what they call a vulnerability equities process, the VEP. And basically, the vulnerability equities process, when you go develop one of these exploits, you find a vulnerability in a system, because NSA is in charge of both offense and defense, as it turns out, for the nation, at least in the cyber and signals intelligence range. There's a competing interests here, right? The offensive guys want to go use this to go gain foreign intelligence, and the defensive guys are looking and going, holy crap, you just found an exploit, and we've got systems that are vulnerable to that exploit. We need to go patch that, report it, and patch it now. And so the VEP, as part of the VEP, a bunch of folks from the intelligence community get together, they hammer it out, and ultimately a decision is made. Do we report it or do we not report it? Right? And this system is, there's been a lot written on this. It's a great research piece to go take a look at some of the stuff that's been written. But the system's inherently flawed, I think, inherently flawed. But I think a lot of it comes back to, what do you do with something? I think we look at, like, for instance, the exploit called Eternal Blue that was responsible for the WannaCry and the Petya event inside of Ukraine. And I think you look at this and you step back, and it's clear from the compile dates in the code, right, being back in 2013, and the fact that it was only patched patched in March, after now it's released through the Washington Post, that NSA told Microsoft about it, or DoD told Microsoft about it in January, right? I basically said, well, we're positive now that these foreign actors, whoever they are, have this code. They may release it. You better patch it, right? So they let them know back channel. So for years, right, and we assume that nobody else had figured this out, right? But for years, we have this thing, right, that has the ability to do both great harm and great good, right? Give, in lots of our own government networks, even our classified networks potentially, a huge sucking chest wound,
Yeah.
right? And we're not moving on it, right? So
it's
the
like
question of where is the line, I think there's and it's a hard thing to define exactly where that line is at, but if you're looking at the capability that you've just developed, there's no defense for, or no effective defense for, maybe is that the time that you walk that back and kind of...
That's also the whole problem with cyber munitions, right?
Of course.
It has value right up to the point that you use it, and then that can also come back on
Yes.
you as well. So that's a very complicated fight to get into.
No question.
So, but that gets into the ethics of it. Was the government negligent in not letting Microsoft know back in 2013 about this? And there's people that would argue the government should notify everybody of the vulnerability they discover immediately. And that's ridiculous. That's the magical unicorn world. The government needs to be able to do things.
Yes.
They need to be able to operate. And they need to be able to exploit computer systems, gain access to protect our best interests. And that's just part of it. And if anybody thinks that every nation state isn't doing that,
Ridiculous.
they're completely delusional. So that's a really good example of just like, is that good, is that bad? But it goes back to what you said. It's something that's sitting on the table, it's inert, until it's used in one way or the other.
Go ahead.
A fun parallel for this, again, to flip it a little back to the firearms community. Let's say, and you can tell me if this is off base, a new type of revolutionary metallurgy in a very private lab creates small arms, like pistol caliber rounds, that can penetrate body armor better than we've ever seen. Because, oh my God, they splinter through the fiber, and all of a sudden Kevlar is just...
NIJ level 4
Right.
irrelevant, pistol
Right.
round, bam. Yep.
But if you then say, oh my God, all of our guys are wearing this armor. At the same time, as they're testing it, they say, well, look, it's amazing. If you change the weave pattern on the Kevlar, it totally Fs up how this round penetrates, and it would actually mitigate it. Do you instantly reissue new Kevlar, and then perhaps this round was useful for a special ops mission? You needed this, but now, well, the enemy's going to know as soon as you mention it. Or do you just keep that round very quietly, hoping that you'll get to use it maybe even once in theater, but knowing that there's possibly other people out there that are going to discover the same thing and leave a bunch of your guys vulnerable?
That is actually a great analogy.
That's pretty much nails it.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah. The only difference is we can patch and fix things, hopefully in a matter of hours. That sounds like it's a much more long-term...
Yeah.
It could be, the consequences go on much
Yeah,
longer.
the point is you put something in a drawer that gives you such a tactical advantage that you know that if you had to engage a peer or near peer enemy, that you would have such a tactical advantage that your chances of success are greatly enhanced.
Yeah.
That's the same thing as not disclosing an exploit or vulnerability in, say, Windows that you don't want to put out to the public because you're going to keep that in your back pocket if and when that cyber war with Albonistan actually goes hot.
Right.
That's the same equivalent. It's exactly the same. A lot of people don't get that. They think it should be always disclosure. But then that also means, just like you said, we've developed this new round that's a pistol round that defeats NIJ-4 body armor. Why would you give that to your enemy? It's the same exact equivalent.
But it's also possible they develop the same thing, right? And you sit vulnerable, and it's used against you before you get a chance to use it against them.
Well, that's where secrecy comes in, right?
Well, no
That's-
question, right?
Yeah.
But look, I think if we're talking about secrecy, I think demonstrably we're having a problem with that right now, particularly in the cyberspace, right? Vault 7 and Shadow Brokers demonstrate that without question. So,
Do you think the likelihood is always that, hey, information is going to leak?
Yes.
without
Like,
a doubt,
the idea
yes.
of keeping malware secret,
No,
is that ever
it's
even a
gonna have
battle
shelf
worth
life.
having?
In fact, the fact that it took this long
Yeah.
is actually an incredible surprise.
Yeah. So you have in this case, as you're using this stuff again, you're leaving behind forensic artifacts. The difference between this and a shell casing, right? Coming back to the difference between malware and a shell casing, is that from the shell casing, I can't tell in a lot of cases who it was, how it was built, where it was built, when it was built, the gun that was fired from. In the case of malware, we can fully do that, and also then take all of those capabilities, repurpose those, and turn around and shoot them back at the aggressor.
And you can do that in some situations within hours.
Within hours, absolutely. In fact, you're probably familiar with the idea of Windows having Patch Tuesday. John, the day after Patch Tuesday?
It's where we run around crazy with our hair on fire.
Absolutely, Exploit Wednesday, right? So again, it's that quick that we're turning around and creating these exploits.
For the audience's edification, when you say that, are you saying that the patches introduce new vulnerabilities?
No,
No.
no,
Well,
no,
an
no,
attacker-
no, no.
won't an
The attacker
attacker-
can reverse
they'll
engineer
diff their
like
system.
the
See
Oh,
what
okay.
you
I want them
fixed.
to understand that.
Oh,
so,
sure,
so you're
certainly.
taking the patch and going, okay, what did they patch?
Yes.
Why did they
And then-
patch? And then flipping it around.
Absolutely.
flipping around and turning it into an offensive capability. But all of this, I want to step back just for a couple of
Yeah.
seconds because, we get on these fringes and we talk about like really advanced scenarios. And what I think that a lot of people don't understand, and I think that they need to understand, is that these advanced scenarios are not required to break into the vast majority of corporations.
Amen, brother.
We break into corporations constantly, and we don't need to have the cutting edge exploit to do
Yeah.
it. We don't need what's called a 0-day. A 0-day is an exploit for a computer system that is not patched. We don't. And one of the fundamental things that bothers us quite a bit is we're not seeing the defenses improve hardly at all in many organizations. And that's why it's so important to have the capability to demonstrate risk to corporations so that they can actually start taking those steps to make their networks better. And that's why we need that proliferation of these cyber arms, of having the capability in malware so that people can learn how to protect their networks. And as soon as that is lost, then I think whatever country, you were talking about cyber arms race, whatever country, if we're talking Germany or whoever, basically makes cyber arms and malware illegal, that company is now at a grave disadvantage because they're no longer going to have the ability to test their own defenses effectively and be ready for the attacks that are coming.
To bring it back to physical space again, but not guns. This would be one right up your alley. So you
Yeah.
walk up to a building, and there's a big reinforced door, 8 deadbolts, all abloy locks, right? With a window next to it that you smash, put your hand through and unlock. So this is the point, is that there's this huge vulnerability right here. And if you were to do this in the physical space, and you had someone come up to you and go, great door, that window's a problem, you're a criminal. You go to jail for that.
Well, and
that's-
we all have those conversations, right? You sit around and you have dinner with people, and you talk about what we do. You break into places for a living. You like to work with firearms. We deal with malware. And people immediately like, how dare you? You are a criminal. And I think they're trying to find that
But
safe
your
place that
your
doesn't
point is
exist.
salient in that we're worried about these really edge case, bleeding edge situations, but the reality is most people have a broken window, a door unlocked in the back, and a corporation that's a third party giving away their data.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I love the analogy. You're going to see this in class tomorrow and the next day. The broken window, most people can say, hey, that's a window. I know glass is vulnerable. Imagine that super reinforced door, but with an access card reader on it.
Yep.
And you're going to spend the next 2 days breaking access control systems with a $100 circuit board this big. And the idea that we need to show these, I really hope you get some good footage for people, because it's as simple as behind the card reader, install an extra little chip, and then that door is just shattered for security.
Yep.
And a
The
great
idea of being able to attack it in future and being able to show people, oh, look what we've done. This is a problem. Fix your security. If that little, but couldn't someone take this and then go knock off a drug treatment center and take away all the hospital drugs? Yeah, But suppressing people from even talking about it in class or developing this
Doesn't
little tool doesn't stop that the fact that somebody else would probably come up with that attack.
Right.
Well, it's like software-defined radio hacking is now getting very, very, very prominent in our community. So take, for example, your garage door openers. Take example, the key fobs for your car. It is trivial to attack those to the point where we can almost break into any garage door anywhere in the United States with like hacker F1. What do we can do with yardstick? For like $150, you can basically set this up, full step-by-step instructions to do so.
This is Security Plus, rolling code.
Yep, just
How many viewers right now have their gun safes in their garage, not bolted
With
down?
a tubular lock.
just makes it easy
Yeah.
to steal just about anything. And one of the things I'd like to point out is I'm a firm believer that things are only fragile until they break. Once you break something, then you're at the point of how do we put it together to make it stronger. And there's a lot of things in this country that need to be broken, and they need to be tested, and they need to be rebuilt so that they're better, and that's what we do. And if we stop doing what we do, then things aren't going to get broken, things are not going to get better, and I believe that it puts everybody at a much greater risk than where they're at right now.
Well, I don't want to take your guys' whole evening, but let's sum it up at this, I think, and then we'll finish off with some
That's a
closing
great-
thoughts. That's a
great
good way to
thought,
end.
yeah.
So I think the reality is the answer is never ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance in a negative way. Ignorance, the definition of it is just blissfully trying to ignore something or not trying to educate you about something because it's an uncomfortable truth or reality. I don't want to look at this because it's painful, therefore I'm going to remain ignorant of it. That's never the answer, whether it's guns, malware, software, vulnerabilities, your door lock. And I think that's the problem, is that when you codify into law intentionally forced willful ignorance except for a small subset of people, you've deprecated the research, development, and education of society as a whole, leaving really a void for the bad guys, to put in air quotes, to run amok because they're not going to care about your law. Is that pretty much the summary?
Pretty much.
I feel fair with that. Yeah,
I'm okay
definitely.
with that.
Yeah.
You guys want to close off with any closing statements on that? Because I think that was a good one right there, quite honestly.
I think we need to invite people in the firearms community to come to the table. Just start doing some research. There's a bunch of things that you can research and just do some YouTube videos on hacking. And I have videos out there with Black Hills Information Security.
He's one of the best
presentations
speakers
that you've
of
given
presentations.
on rendition.
Yep.
So start looking into it, because a lot of the gun people that I know, they're really into history. They're really into the technology. They're really into knowing how something works. This could be a great hobby. Know how this works. We're inviting you. Please come hang out with us. Look at what we do. You don't have to be an expert, but be smarter than the people that are writing the news stories that you're reading.
Yeah, most of them are pretty bad. I'll kind of close off with with another thought here, and forgive the parallel, but a lot of times we get a lot of negative press during the gun owners. I'm a fellow gun owner as well, and we get a lot of negative press during a mass shooting. Right, people come out of the woodwork and they're like, why do we even have guns in the first place? Right, I would say our biggest mass shooting of the year on the cyber side, probably of the decade, is going to be Equifax. And most of your viewers have likely been impacted by Equifax. I know I have. Personally, I think most people in the United States will eventually be. We haven't worked the Equifax breach directly, but it is pretty clear at this point that there was a web application that was taken over, and it was taken over by a malicious actor, right, who stole this data. I am confident today, right, this is equivalent, basically our cyber mass shooting, of the year. I'm confident today that Equifax, one, is investing in more training, simulation slash, penetration testing, the stuff that we do, right, basically bringing those cyber weapons to the table for practice. I'm positive that the other credit reporting bureaus and banks and others, I know because a lot of them are calling us. I'm sure you've gotten some calls as well, right? And so as you look at this, it's an interesting place where in the case of in the physical space of a mass shooting, people step back and they're like, whoa, gotta control those guns. And it's really interesting. We're looking at exactly the opposite happening here, where as a result of, they're like, bring lots of guns into our network, bring lots of cyber weapons here, because we've got to get secure. And the only way for us to get secure is to, basically is again to do those simulations.
Steve, your thoughts?
I think the better voices in the room summarized it better than I ever could. I'm just really thrilled we could all be here to take a minute and talk about it. Let's go raise a glass to Marcus in a bit.
Very
Good point. I want to thank you for taking time out with me on this very busy time for you guys in your schedule to do this for the audience. What I'm trying to do with this, hopefully with this channel, is really make the point that the gun owner's plight and the plight that you're talking about is very similar. They're not different. They're the same problem. Maybe one's physical space, one's digital space, but the reality is allowing the media to dictate what we think and how we perceive the world, and for the government to then legislate in a way that enforces willful ignorance is not the answer on any of this. And so what we need to do is educate ourselves, promote the idea of freedom and liberty in terms of free thought, free thinking, and not let the media dictate that thinking in the process, and not be the slowest gazelle in the pack, which you touched on. But sometimes that's all it takes. So, guys, I want to thank you again for your time on this.
Thanks for having
and
us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Hopefully this made sense and you grok some of this. I'll go ahead and link to your respective organizations, if you don't mind, in the description. And I would really implore you to continue watching this kind of content, but also researching more of it on your own, because this is actually more important than the gun thing. This is going to affect your life even stronger than whether or not you can carry your gun to the mall or not. I guarantee it. Thanks for watching.